Hi, this is Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the SonicScoop podcast. And today, I'm going to do an episode that breaks my heart to do. I actually hate doing episodes like this, but unfortunately, people seem to love it when I do episodes like this. Well, some people hate it when I do episodes like this because this is an episode where I am going to do some rebuttals to bad arguments for super high resolution audio. I really wish I could just put this topic to bed, but whenever I put out a video on this topic, it becomes one of the more popular videos on the channel. So it's one of these things where I did articles about this way back in 2011, more than a decade ago, and I thought this whole thing had been settled. But just because something is known doesn't mean it's known by everybody. And I get it. I used to really misunderstand super high resolution sound myself. And there are some great people doing tremendous work today as audio engineers, music producers who also misunderstand super high resolution audio. I did an episode earlier this year, about 7 months ago. It was originally titled, Why Super High Res Audio is Dumb. And in it, I'm making a face like this about how dumb it is. And I actually ended up changing the title of that episode after the fact. It was extremely popular. It got tons of clicks and views and comments, most of them positive, but there were comments and feedback from people who absolutely hated that episode and who thought that I was calling them dumb for being into super high resolution audio. So I want to get this out of the way before I get into any of these rebuttals or any of this conversation. If you're into super high res audio, I don't think you're dumb. I used to think that super high resolution audio might be a good idea, and I don't think I'm dumb. I think the idea is dumb. I think I believed something that now I playfully refer to as dumb, but that doesn't mean I was dumb. It means that I had a misunderstanding. And I think that as soon as you get this cleared up, you can start focusing on the things that really matter in music production and not obsess too much about the things that really don't. Before we get into some of the most common arguments, counter arguments that people gave me and my rebuttals to them, I just want to give a quick synopsis to why I think super high resolution audio is silly or makes no sense. And I get why people would think it makes sense. I mean, if you've ever heard digital audio at 24 bits, 44.1K sample rate, we'll talk about what that means in just a second, it sounds pretty good. And you all of a sudden think, well, what if we got those numbers up? Those are rookie numbers. Let's push those numbers up, baby. And if only we had super high resolution audio, higher and higher resolutions, then finally music and audio devices would sound good again, like they used to back in the day. Here's the thing. Objectively speaking, by any reasonable standard, we have the best audio in the history of the world. And I don't just mean at the high end. I mean like consumer devices like a computer or a laptop have D to A converters that are perfectly fine and way better than old school analog tape machines, if you are judging them by how accurate they are to the source. The best that an old school analog tape machine could do from just an objective scientific standpoint would be to get really accurate to the source. And they did that less well, by and large, than cheap consumer digital devices do today. That said, tape machines can sound badass and awesome by making things sound slightly different from the original source in ways that are way cool, I think is the technical term. And I use all sorts of saturation when I do mastering to this day and mixing. When you're mixing, and honestly, when you're mastering as well, what are you doing but creatively applying distortion and messing things up? And I'm using distortion very broadly here. We're morphing the signal from where it once was. Even with EQ or compression or limiting or any type of sweetening that we do, we're making the signal sound less like it was in a way that's cool. So big points for analog audio in that regard. Man, we're just a few minutes in this episode. I've already gone off into one major tangent. I'll try to keep those down to an absolute minimum. But I think that is relevant to the overall discussion here. One of the things is that people sometimes don't realize how good we have it right now and how good the basic consumer formats are. I mean, if you look at CD quality sound, 16 bits, 44.1K sampling rate, that is objectively better than any other consumer format in the history of audio if you're talking about how accurate it is to the source. But you could say that might be good, but we can do even better. We can make things sound sweeter and smoother and warmer by getting those rookie numbers up. What about 88.2 sampling rate? What about 96 sampling rate? And people really do believe, and they really believe they've heard differences that make them say that going to higher sample rates, higher bit depths should help improve audio quality, and if only we could get everyone on that bandwagon. The big problem is that usually comes out of a misconception about how digital audio works, and a misconception about how you actually have to listen to devices to make sure that you're hearing real differences and not accidentally misleading yourself. That's number one. Or hearing a real actual difference that's caused by a different reason than the one that you think is causing that difference. Man, that sounds like a lot to chew on, but let's break it down and simplify it. So here's a quick synopsis before we get into the counter arguments I get about why high-res audio is actually awesome and what I have to say about those counter arguments. I'll also, in the end, give you a couple of counter arguments I think could be good ones that almost no one ever makes. So if you are into high-res audio and you want to argue against what I'm saying, well, I will give you the ammunition to do it at the end of this episode. All right, so here's all the background technical information you need to understand this whole episode. There's really two components in the quality of an audio file. Pretty much, let's boil it down to your sample rate and your bit depth. The bit depth, people believe that by increasing the bit depth, we can have better and better sounding audio. But this basically is not the case. The only thing that the bit depth of your audio does is determine how low the noise floor of your audio is. If you go from a bit depth of 16-bit to 24-bit, all you are doing is lowering the noise floor. And in both of those formats, 16-bit or 24-bit, as long as your audio that people are actually going to hear isn't anywhere near the noise floor, there is no discernible difference between those two audio formats. And I don't only mean theoretically, there should be no discernible difference, like there's no reason there should be a discernible difference. In actual blind listening tests, where you test people's listening on 16-bit files versus 24, there is no discernible difference. Unless you record things that are so quiet and so by the noise floor and then jack up the level of the noise floor super loud so that you can actually hear it. But in the real world, the noise floor of both 16-bit and 24-bit audio is stupidly low, so ridiculously low that you never actually really run into that issue. At 16-bit, it is something like 96 dB of headroom. Your noise floor is 96 dB down below the maximum peak you can record. And that is a huge gap. And for consumer audio playback, it's way more than enough. Even for recording audio, it's probably way more than enough. That's a way lower noise floor than any analog format ever had. And that 96 dB of dynamic range, all we're really trying to fit in there is often, 14 dB of dynamic range is like what Spotify recommends you shoot for. And that's extremely dynamic because most popular music recordings have way less than 14 dB of average dynamic range. Most records are actually mixed and mastered way hotter than that. And even for like jazz and classical that actually uses a lot of dynamic range, they're not approaching using anywhere near 96 dB of dynamic range. That said, there is a fair argument that just to make it even easier to record, why don't we make that window even bigger, 24 bits? Why not give us an even bigger window so we don't have to worry about it at all? And 24 bits has become a standard in the pro audio world, largely for that reason. And 24 bits of audio is so much dynamic range, 144 dB, that there's actually no interface, no A to D converter that you can plug your stuff into that can actually use that full 144 dB of dynamic range. So the bit depth just is not the bottleneck. Unless you're recording your signal, so like it's teeny tiny, you can't even like see it on the meters and can't even hear it. Like unless you're recording that quietly, there's going to be no improvement to going up. There's just no mechanism by which that would sound better. Now, the one caveat I'll add here is that down around the noise floor of digital audio, the noise there doesn't sound as good and as pleasant and as pleasing and as neutral as it does in an analog system. It's not just pure white noise. So to deal with that issue, we do something called dithering. And I have a whole episode about dithering and what it is, and it's really simple, and you actually don't have to worry about it that much in all practical reality. But if you want to check out that episode, I have a whole episode called Dithering Demystified. But with sample rate, it's a similar kind of thing where past a certain point, increasing it further doesn't help. And there's no mechanism by which it can help. And this is something that is commonly misunderstood and is even misunderstood by some major, awesome producers and engineers who I have tremendous respect for, who are, multi-platinum selling producers and engineers who've won multiple Grammys and who I have tremendous respect for their craft. And I actually got some responses from some of those people on the last episode I did, telling me I was wrong and just reiterating that they didn't actually understand this point about how the sample rate works. Because it's easy to miss. And this is the thing that I had the most trouble with myself as well. If you want to record an analog signal that exists out there in the real world into a digital device, you have to make samples of it. The computer literally takes these little tiny snapshots, thousands upon thousands of them in a second, little tiny snapshots of the audio in order to record it, and then it plays those snapshots back. You can think of the sample rate almost like the shutter speed for film or video application. And obviously there's a point where increasing the shutter speed on a film camera or a video camera is going to change the look and feel. And there's a point where increasing the shutter speed further might even help with processing that happens later on. But there's also going to be a point past which you increase the shutter speed further and all you're doing is using up extra data to literally no additional benefit. And this happens with audio as well. The question is, where is that point and how do we discover it? Because we all know there's going to be a point of diminishing returns in this like anything else. So the thing you have to know about the sample rate is in order to record or play back a sound in digital audio, you need a sample rate that's slightly more than twice the frequency you're trying to record or play back. Human beings hear from about 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz, it's commonly said, although that's pretty generous. Most adults, especially over the age of 30, cannot hear 18K. Most of them probably can't hear 17K. A lot of them can't hear 16K. If they were musicians actively touring, particularly if they're behind a drum kit, they probably can't hear 15K. But I would recommend testing your own hearing. And if you're above 30, I would be unsurprised if you can't hear above 18K. And I also wouldn't be that surprised if your hearing drops off significantly lower than that. And some of the best mixers and producers and engineers on the planet can't hear these super high frequencies. And we all have ears, incidentally, that hear differently on each side. Our ears are imperfect in many ways. And I have a whole episode about that too. I think it's called Why Your Hearing Sucks and What You Can Do About It. But anyway, let's take this whole 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz thing at face value and pretend that most of us can hear up to 20,000 hertz, which we can't. If we wanted to record and play back 20,000 hertz, we would need a sample rate that is slightly higher than double that, slightly higher than 40,000 hertz. And you know what? We should give ourselves a little bit of an extra room in there because we're going to want to put in what's called an anti-aliasing filter. We have to filter out the super duper sonic frequencies so that we don't cause aliasing, a type of distortion where supersonic frequencies fold back below the aliasing filter. I go into more detail about that in another episode. I don't want to go into super gory detail. I want to give you the basic principle before we get into the actual point of this episode, which is the counter arguments and my rebuttals to them. But long story short, as long as you have a sample rate of something like, 44,100 hertz or 48,000 hertz, you're golden. You can record and play back all the frequencies that human beings can hear, and actually more frequencies than most human beings can hear. And you have probably enough room for a decent slope on an analog anti-aliasing filter. But in practice today, most anti-aliasing filters should employ oversampling, so you actually don't need that much room to do it. That's another more technical conversation we can get into some other day. But I would say that early on, when people did hear a difference between their converter working at one sample rate and their converter working at another sample rate, that was the thing that was probably causing the difference of having a relatively poorly designed old school analog anti-aliasing filter or even digital anti-aliasing filter in the lower sample rate mode of their converter that could be getting rid of a little bit of high frequency or, heavens forbid, adding a little bit of additional resonant peak right before the roll-off. Again, that's a little bit technical, but the general principle here is that once you're able to record or play back a given frequency, throwing more samples at it doesn't help. And this gets us into the very first counter-argument that I want to address. And some people who were extremely reputable, excellent producers and engineers wrote me to say, it's not about the highest frequency you can record or play back. It's about using a higher sample rate so everything sounds better. But the problem is that there is no mechanism in physics by which that could be the case. If you take some sound that doesn't have any energy above 1 kilohertz, say, and you sample it with a really low sample rate, let's say an 8,000 hertz sample rate, that is more than enough to record or play back that sound that goes up to 1,000 hertz. Doubling that sample rate from 8,000 to 16,000 has exactly no effect. It doesn't change how well that signal is recorded or played back. Literally zero effect. Having the sample rate from 8,000 down to 4,000 has no effect on the quality at which that 1,000 hertz sound is recorded or played back. Once you can record or play back a given frequency, that's it. You're done. It doesn't get any better. It's digital. It's basically, it works or it doesn't. And the most important thing is to filter out frequencies higher than the point that you've selected so that you don't get aliasing, which is a type of digital distortion that would occur if you didn't have what's called an anti-aliasing filter, getting rid of the higher stuff that you can't properly record or play back given your sample rate. You can also just test this for yourself and confirm it. And when you're testing this stuff for yourself, you can do null tests, you can do double-blind listening tests, those kinds of things are effective. Now let's get into the other most common counter-arguments about why I'm wrong about high-res audio. Number one is called appeal to authority. And appeal to authority basically means so-and-so, who I think is more reputable than you, and who I think is a more trustworthy source, says the opposite of what you're saying. So therefore, you must be wrong. And that is what we call not an argument at all. It's not even a counter-argument. It's just saying someone else says this other thing. And that doesn't really matter. We're talking about uncovering the truth. What you've got to do is test this stuff for yourself. We can also talk through the theory of it and see if there's gaps in understanding of the theory of it. But we can also practically test this stuff in a number of ways to find out what's right or what's wrong in any given issue. And if you're going to say, well, this bigwig producer engineer who's made awesome sounding records thinks it's a good idea, doesn't really matter. Because, yeah, they make great sounding records. That's what they specialize in. Do they specialize in having a super technical understanding of digital audio? Should they? Probably not. That's not really going to help them make awesome sounding records. Knowing even the stuff I'm telling you now is not going to help you make super awesome sounding records. What's going to help you make super awesome sounding records is going out there and making records again and again and learning the approaches of how other people do it. And I get how this ties into that. You're learning the approaches of other people. And incidentally, one of these great people says, I also like to record at a super high sample rate. And it's like, okay, they like to do that. But is that the thing that's actually helping them? Is that the actual thing that's making them get great sounds? I know some super amazing producer engineers who work at high sample rates, and their work sounds incredible. But guess what? I don't hear their music at a super high sample rate. I hear it at a normal consumer sample rate, and it sounds incredible. And I can tell you, basically for a fact, that if you gave them only gear that worked up to a normal sample rate, it would still sound awesome. Because the thing that's making the records sound awesome isn't their damn sample rate. It's that they're good at making records and they're working with artists who are fun to listen to and they've learned to make great aesthetic choices. And they believe that one of the important aesthetic choices that they're making is their sample rate. Now, I have to throw in a caveat there because there could be some truth in there. Some converters can sound better at one sample rate rather than another. And that can pretty much only reasonably be explained through differences in the anti-aliasing filter in that device at those two different sample rates. And if you have done some extensive testing, double-blind or null testing, and you're like, man, the difference is subtle, but it's there, so I'm going to do it, then like have at it. Go for it. Keep using the higher sample rate that works for you. But ultimately, it's not really about the sample rate. So we'll get into that a little bit deeper. So the second most common counter argument, this is even more common than the first one, appeal to authority, is what's called ad hominem. And ad hominem means basically, you suck. So this is the other most common counter argument that you'll find if you go through the comments in these videos, is basically, you suck. Maybe you can't hear the difference because you're sucky, but people who are actually good can hear the difference. And also, did I mention that you suck and you can't hear the difference, and that's why you're saying all this stuff? The fact that I suck is irrelevant to the truth. Let's say that I do suck. Let's say that like I'm the worst at audio. Let's say that I'm actually deaf. And right now I can't even hear the own sound of my voice, and somehow I'm still able to speak this clearly. Let's just say that I'm literally deaf. I can't hear audio. I cannot hear the difference between anything in audio. That doesn't change whether or not anything that I'm saying is right or wrong. It either is right or wrong, independent of how much I suck or how awesome I am. So this is kind of the flip side of appeal to authority. They kind of go hand in hand, right? It's where people pick teams and favorite people and they argue through proxies rather than like making actual reasoned counterarguments. So the third most common counterargument when I present these ideas is, well, I can hear it. And that's an interesting one because they're avoiding, it's not quite appeal to authority, it's not quite ad hominem. They're making an argument from their experience. Well, I can hear it. And that's cool. But there's often some problems in the follow-up. The most common problem with these counterarguments when people say, well, I can hear it, is that they almost invariably are missing the importance of double-blind listening, and they either don't believe in the placebo effect or don't believe it applies to them. I've talked about this on other podcast episodes, but there's a famous study about wine where they give people who are the test subjects a glass from a $200 bottle of wine and a glass from a $20 bottle of wine. They ask them to rate the wines, and invariably people prefer what's in the glass from the $200 bottle. Only problem is, joke's on you, both glasses are from the same bottle, and you thought the one that was labeled more expensive tasted better. And they've also been able to confirm that this is not just because they're lying or they want to impress the researchers. They've actually put people into brain scan machines and tested this and discovered that people's pleasure centers light up more when they are drinking the glass of wine from the $200 bottle, because the story they're telling to themselves enhances the experience significantly. So that's one thing. The accounting for the placebo effect, they usually don't do. They're usually often not even aware that they have to do this. I mean, if you remind them, they'll kind of know. It's like, hey, have you ever been turning the EQ on your console or your screen or whatever? And you're like, oh, that sounds a little bit better. It sounds a little brighter, but not as good as I'd like it. And you turn up some more and you're like, oh, it's going in the right direction, but it's not enough. Let me do some more. And then you're like, that looks like a lot, but oh, it's off. Oops, I didn't even have the EQ engaged, or it was on the wrong channel, right? We've all done this kind of thing. So if you remind people of that, then they'll be like, yeah, okay, sure, there's this confirmation bias, placebo effect thing. I get it. But when we're talking about super subtle differences and wanting to uncover the scientific truth, what's really true, then you've got to control for this stuff. If you just want to make records, then you don't have to do any of that. And you don't really have to care that much about your sample rate either. Just go make records and focus on the things that are actually going to improve your results in the studio. But the other way that these but I can hear it people go wrong is that they're not controlling for other variables. Even if they were to be doing double-blind listening tests, which they almost don't ever do, and I often will say to them, okay, go do a double-blind listening test and then get back to me with your results. I never hear back from them. Sometimes I hear back from them because people are like, wow, I thought I could hear the difference between 24-bit 96K and a 320 kilobits per second MP3 file, but like everyone else on Earth who's been tested publicly, I actually can't. Thank you for alerting me to that. Every once in a while I'll get one of those privately, but it's rare that people have that kind of, self-awareness and that kind of humility to say, hey, I can separate myself from the idea. I believed one thing based on a certain set of information. Now I have new information and new evidence and new experiences, and I believe a different thing. And it takes a really big person to do that. And it's hard. And there's so many places in my life where I haven't done that yet, probably. And there's so many places in my life that took way too long before I did that. And I know that in hindsight. So there are these other potential variables, like your anti-aliasing filter is the issue and not the sample rate. But there's people have made these comparisons where it's like, man, when I'm in the studio listening to my high-res audio, it sounds awesome. But then when I put in my earbuds, I'm listening to my iPhone, it sucks. It's like, those are two totally, totally different things. And obviously I'm making an extreme example, but people do versions of that example, where they're basing it on experience. They were at their friend's studio and heard high-res audio and it was awesome, and they were at their own studio and it didn't sound as good. It's like there's so many other things going on. The speakers, the room, even in your own studio from day to day, did you listen back to back? Were they exactly level matched? All of this other stuff, so many other variables that you're not ruling out to decide whether it's actually the resolution of your audio that's changing things or not. And people generally don't do that kind of testing. Nor should they, because honestly, just go make some records. Like, that's how you're going to get better sounding records. But if you really want to know, then that's how you've got to do it. Okay. And then there's one more counter argument. This one's super common. Maybe I should have led with this one first or just made an episode about this because it needs some debunking. And that is that there's one study conducted in Japan one time in was it 1990? Look at my notes here. It's like in the 1990s. And in this study from Japan, they believe that they have the holy grail for, people can actually hear and be influenced by supersonic frequencies way above what we normally think of as being the maximum of human hearing. And this one study in Japan shows it. There's so many problems with that argument, though. And here's the first of them. It was one study one time that has never been replicated by anyone else ever anywhere else. So that's one thing, right? There's been no one else ever corroborating this result that they supposedly got. Number two, if you actually read the study, it doesn't really show what people wish it would show. They play people a bunch of different musical examples. There's a whole bunch of different genres, and they play them at kind of more standard resolution and one with supersonic frequencies added. And in every single one of those, they discerned no difference between those two, the super high res and the non-super high res, except in one music sample. And that was, I believe it was some gamelan chime music, very unusual kind of music. If you've never heard some gamelan chime music, you probably should, but it was just in that one piece of music, this gamelan chime music, where apparently they noticed some differences in the way people perceived that music at a regular sample rate and a super high sample rate. But there's other easy explanations there. Everything else sounded the same to everybody and had no different effect. This one piece, there was some difference in, maybe there was a problem with the way that one piece was transcoded or sampled or something like that. That's a possibility. But even before you get into that, it was an extremely small sample size. There were not very many people in this study at all. And in addition to that, the thing that they were looking at was brain scans of people, which have to be interpreted by some third-party person, looking at this imaging of blood flow in the brain, and there's some subjectivity in there, but also potential other causes where they would see differences in the blood flow for this particular one. And again, with how small the sample size was, it could just happen to a couple or a few people, and then all of a sudden it's bordering on statistical significance. The reality is that as much as I love science, and science is a great process, there is a huge issue in the scientific literature with something called irreproducibility, meaning studies that have never been reproduced, you find one out there that kind of shows a result bordering on statistical significance. Someone else tries to reproduce it. They don't get any results whatsoever, so they never publish the study. So you never end up seeing like the 10 other studies that people did and was like, oh, there was no difference. Why would we publish this? It's boring. No journal wants to run that. Doesn't get run. So there's also the sample bias in studies. But basically, one study with an extremely small sample size where on pretty much all of the musical pieces that were played, people heard no difference. And then one, it's like maybe the researchers kind of said that they maybe heard a difference, but based on a small sample size with some fairly subjective readings, and there could be other reasons that occurred, it's just not that compelling. Does it suggest that people should try to replicate the study and see if they get the same results? Awesome. Have at it. Please do it. And if you want to sell people on super high resolution audio, that's exactly the kind of thing you should probably be doing, because all the other stuff you've been trying to do hasn't really sold people on super high resolution audio, because pretty much all of the double-blind listening tests say that past a certain point, even the most golden-eared of audio engineers cannot reliably discern a difference. Like, there's no super golden-eared audio engineer who has yet demonstrated that in a properly controlled double-blind trial, they can hear the difference between 320 kilobits per second MP3 and any higher resolution. So the next most common counter-argument I get is what would be called a straw man, I guess. It's another one of these logical fallacies, which is basically misrepresenting the argument that I'm actually making and arguing against that. So the argument that I'm making, I just want to be clear, and I think I was very careful to do this in every episode that I've mentioned, is not that there are no benefits in going up in bit depth or sample rate at all. It's just that there's a point of diminishing returns past which there's probably no benefit, or past which there's only some benefit for some extremely niche applications. Like if you want to do sound design, and you want to record a bunch of sounds and then pitch them down extremely low, recording with a super high sample rate makes a ton of sense, because then you won't lose all of your high frequencies when you pitch the thing down extremely low. If you're recording mating songs for bats, or doing experiments with insects or something, and you need to record super high frequencies, absolutely makes sense. This technology should exist. And oversampling, really high sample rates, can make sense internally in a lot of plugins and processors, and it would be my argument that you don't have to run your whole session at that sample rate for that to work. You can just internally oversample in the DAW. Oversampling is a beautiful, wonderful thing. It's integrated into hardware devices to make anti-aliasing filters better. It's integrated into plugins to make those things work better. It's a tremendous thing, but because oversampling is an option, oversampling means using a higher sample rate for processing where it's appropriate without you having to run your whole session at a super high sample rate. And then there is the last most common argument about this, and that is where people agree that I'm basically right, but they say that they like to use high-res audio anyway for a reason that is totally reasonable, like one of the ones that I just mentioned. Like they've tested and they've discovered that their converter does sound better to them at that sample rate, and they've done the kind of testing that I've said. That's a very rare counter-argument. When it comes up, it's like, awesome, but we can agree that the thing probably isn't the sample rate itself, right? And they're like, yeah, probably. So it's almost like not even a counter-argument. We're kind of just in agreement, and I agree with them. And if your converter sounds better at a higher sample rate, do it. And if all I've encouraged you to do is test that and like figure out whether it matters or not, and whatever answer you come up with is a good answer. So do that. Or they'll say they want to, use plugins that don't employ oversampling, and they think that they should, and so they want to run their whole session at a higher sample rate, and that can make sense. Some of them are a little less persuasive to me. Like people have said, hey, at a higher sample rate, there could be less latency on my recording or virtual instruments. Like there's a shorter round trip for latency. And that is potentially true, but the caveat there is that as you go up in processing demands, the likelihood that you'll need to use a larger buffer size goes up. So maybe you can get away with a 32 sample buffer size at the lower sample rate, and then all of a sudden you go up to a higher sample rate, but now you can only do a 64 sample buffer size, so your latency is the same either way. But that said, on your system, maybe there is some benefit to the higher sample rate in terms of latency. I don't think that plays out in a practical way most of the time. But again, test it for yourself. See if you can get better results out of a higher sample rate latency-wise. I just think there's so many workarounds to that these days, and I don't really feel like that's an issue, because if you are using a kind of more normal standard sampling rate and it allows you to simply lower your buffer size enough, like latency pretty much becomes negligible. And there's input monitoring and other options to make it even more negligible. All right, so now I've got to go into very briefly some of the arguments I think people could make that would be better. And number one argument on this front is we don't have the right kinds of tests yet. I agree with you, Justin, that in all the double-blind listening studies we have to date, it shows that there's this point of diminishing returns. People can't really discern a difference between 16-bit and 24-bit in and of itself, or between 48K and 96K in and of itself, once you're properly controlling for other factors. However, the differences that you can consciously hear, the differences that you can consciously come to recognize, aren't the only differences that are possibly meaningful. What if there are subconscious effects that we might have when listening to a really good 320 kilobits per second MP3 compared to a super high resolution format? And sure, we take the golden-eared audio engineers, we put them in a proper double-blind trial. They can't hear the difference. But what if it's doing something to them that we haven't yet been able to measure? And I respect that this Japanese study with the brain scans was kind of trying to do this, and I think ultimately, in my opinion, failed to do that. But I think it makes me feel like there should be more follow-up studies. Here's the thing, though. It's been 30 years, and no one has, shown it ever to have happened again, so that should say something. And there's people out there who stand to make a lot of money if they can sell people on going to even higher resolution audio. Like, there's a whole industry that could be created out of that. It's happened before. People got rid of all their vinyl records or put them in the closet and rebought all the vinyl records they owned on CD because it was the thing to do now. And then people rebought all their CDs, or now went and switched to streaming even though they already owned all of the CDs. People have done this before when there's been some proven benefit to them. So you could make a whole industry out of actually proving this. So go and prove it if you want to prove it. But I think an even more likely path, and this would be a study I'd love to see, is you split people into two groups and you give them a whole library of music to listen to. One's at a higher sample rate or higher bit rate, and the other one's at a lower one. And you study these two groups and you look at their consumption of music over time. You also control for it a little bit by looking at what their consumption of music looks like beforehand on whatever devices they're using. And now you try to find out, is the group with the better resolution audio, are they reporting a better experience with music? Are they engaging with the music more often? Are they listening to it more often? Do they start listening to different types of music more often? That would be a really cool study to do, in addition to a brain scanning thing. And I don't think it would be prohibitively difficult to do this kind of study. So ultimately, I have ways that I could be totally shown to be wrong in my current perspective on this. I am not on team anti-high res. And one of the reasons I was able to come to my perspective on that now is that I wasn't originally on team pro high res. I've just always, I hope this doesn't sound too self-congratulatory, but always been on team curious about audio and how it works and finding out more and trying to figure out what matters and what doesn't. That's the team that I'm on. So there's a standard of evidence by which I could be totally dissuaded of everything that I believe now. You could do some of these studies and totally reframe my mind on it. Or if someone came out of the woodwork and they finally took and succeeded the Golden Ears Challenge, where I will do a glowing feature piece on you, and maybe feature interview too if you want, in addition to a written article, about you, if you can show in a publicly done double-blind trial that you can hear the difference between 320 kilobits per second MP3 and any other higher resolution format. You do that, you've won the Golden Ears Challenge. You have proved that you have climbed audio Mount Everest. Instead of saying, as so many casual internet commenters do, oh yeah, I climb audio Mount Everest all the time. I can hear the difference. I hear the difference if you can, obviously you're deaf, me and all the bigwigs, we can hear the difference. Have I ever taken photographs of me at the top of Mount Everest? No. Has anyone ever seen me up there? No. But me and my buddies talk about how we climb Mount Everest all the time. So we've climbed it. And it's like, you need more than that. You're literally claiming to have done something that no one has done before in any publicly done, properly controlled trial. And the whole properly controlled thing is really important. And sometimes people really go on about in the comments where they're like, well, I can do it. I know I can do it. And it's like, okay, here's how an ABX tester works. Do a double-blind trial, do them on your own. And once you feel like, man, I could ace this, then just come back to me and we'll set up the trial and you'll prove to us that you can. And basically everyone disappears after that. Probably because either they never had any interest in actually showing that they can do this and they maybe don't even believe that they can, or they tried doing double-blind listening tests and they were like, oh, I get it now. Because that's what happened to me and to so many other people. And this is not to say that I have bad hearing. In double-blind listening tests, I am a total dork and I can discern really small differences, much smaller than the average person. And if you give me 128 kilobytes per second MP3 in any other high resolution format, I can, all day long tell you which one is which, even though I have to admit those differences have become increasingly subtle in recent years. But I've also felt that thing where it's like I'm listening to the 320 kilobits per second MP3 and I'm listening to the super high resolution audio file. I'm like, oh man, I can totally hear the difference. It's as clear as night and day. And then all of a sudden you put the blindfold on and it's like, wait a second, where did it go? It's like a mirage. I had it. I could articulate what the differences were. I was telling you and speaking them. But now that I don't know which is which, I can't grasp at them. And now it's become no better than chance. And that is the experience of pretty much any super amazing golden-eared audio engineer who's ever finally sat down and done that kind of testing in a double-blind way has had. A lot of them are surprised to find out that at first they actually can't discern 128 kilobits per second MP3s from higher resolutions, but they find that if they practice it enough, they can do that. And they might be able to do higher bit rates than that too, and I can do some higher bit rates than that as well. But it's something you have to learn to listen for, especially in this day and age where the codecs have gotten better and better, and where the differences are more about darkness on top, which is very different than back in the day when it was cymbals going when you were listening to a 64 kilobits per second file on Napster or something. Not that I ever used Napster or LimeWire. I did. That's another way that I was horribly wrong. Anyway, I hope this episode has been interesting or useful for you. Do you have a counter-argument to anything that I've said that doesn't involve all of the most common counter-arguments that we went through already? If so, I'd absolutely love to hear it. Let me know in the comments down below about how I'm wrong, keeping in mind that you can't appeal to authority. This person I like does good work and they say it's good, so it must be good. You can't use ad hominem attacks. Well, you can't hear the difference because you're dumb and you're deaf. Even if I was, it doesn't change whether or not it's true. Asserting, well, I can hear it, and it's like you've never done a double-blind trial, and you have not actually controlled for other variables that could be getting you a different result. So it has to be properly controlled double-blind trial. You shouldn't just simply contradict a fact of physics, like there's no mechanism by which increasing the sample rate from 44.1K to 88.2K could make 1K sound any different. Like there's no theoretical mechanism for that to occur, and there's been no evidence to show that that does occur. So without bringing either theory or practice to support a contradiction, don't make one, like either the theory or the practical evidence. Or that study in Japan from the 1990s, from more than 30 years ago, that's never been replicated, it was an extremely small sample size, didn't actually show that people could hear a difference on every single clip of music except for one. And it's like, maybe there was something up with that music clip. Why couldn't they hear a difference on anything else? Why was it only a couple people out of a really small sample size? So that one is just, sorry, it's not a winner. And I agree with you, but I'm going to use higher sample rates anyway for one of the many caveated reasons you gave about why like, why not? Have at it. Go for it. All right, well, I hope this episode has been useful for you, and I hope to not do one on audio resolution again for a long, long time. Please tell me if you think I have to. Like, I don't want to be sentenced to doing episodes in audio resolution twice a year for the rest of my life. So please tell me that we're done, or if we're not done, please tell me why and why I need to go on about this again. Thanks for hanging out with me. This has been Justin Colletti of the SonicScoop podcast. I didn't do any plugs for sponsors on this one because I didn't want to. I didn't know if it would be too controversial for some of them, so not plugging any sponsors. The only thing I'm going to plug is we got a course. If you liked hearing me talk for this long, you're absolutely crazy, and you'd be crazy in love with my full-length course, Mixing Breakthroughs. You can check it out at mixingbreakthroughs.com. Comes with a money-back guarantee for 30 days. It's going to change the way you mix forever for the better. Check it out at mixingbreakthroughs.com. Or if you want to learn everything that I know about mastering and the really important stuff in mastering, not things like sample rate and dither, which I talk about but are not super important, you can check out Mastering Demystified. Learn everything you need to know about making great sounding masters at masteringdemystified.com. Also a money-back guarantee on that one. Focus on what really matters, and for those things that may or may not matter, if you want to have fun with it, do some testing. And if you don't want to do some testing, just don't be so certain about yourself. No big deal. That's the end of this episode. Thanks for hanging out with me. This has been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Catch you next time.